Okay, so let's just start. So it's about, refurbished propaganda of this expiring industry, and it really abuses the climate protection movement. And in order to illustrate this, I would like to give an example. It is the very same industry that has been telling us for at least 30 years that nuclear power can save the climate, and they do this time and again. For 60 years, this industry is pampered without being able to show anything in terms of protecting the climate. And now we have the next ER offensive, and now they're attacking the young climate movement. And there are some artistic distortions. So this is that they are suggesting that the Fridays for Future movement was also a pro-nuclear movement. Well, I think this is highly problematic. So what we are seeing here is a screenshot of a YouTube movie that was, cause of a lot of uproar last autumn. Let me see if I can control the slides. Well, actually, you should be able to see the next slide. Okay. And this video clip was on a YouTube channel called Funk, which is provided by two German TV channels, ARD and ZDF. So it is directed to a young target group of the 14 to 29-year-olds. And as far as the mistakes as to the content, well, I wrote a lot about this in my blog, and this was really a masterpiece of opinion management. So there was a huge outcry and uproar, and there were complaints against the TV channel operators of ZDF and ARD, the first and second German TV channels. And now in April, a more toned down variant of this video clip was available. So it was worth protesting. So let's take a look at the network behind this. And we're going to shed some light on the topic that you announced, Gabi, because we're going to hear about the propaganda, and we're also going to talk about the military drivers behind this. The design agency that did this is called Kurz gesagt in a nutshell. And they also have an English language version of this pro-nuclear advertising film. And you see in the credentials that it was supported by the Breakthrough Energy Coalition. So some of you may already perk up, because it's a group of billionaires who think they know better than democratic institutions. They think they know how to stop climate change. And with a lot of money, they are buying a lot of media presence. And what's behind this is at least one startup investor of the nuclear industry. Now let's take a closer look at this entire network. You're swamped by a lot of logos that you can see here with the thin lines crisscrossing them. So the Breakthrough Energy Coalition was founded by Bill Gates, a nuclear investor. And in 2006, he set up a company, a nuclear startup that was called TerraPower. And they want to build fourth generation power generators, so small modular reactors, as we heard about repeatedly today. And this matter calls them PowerPoint reactors, so they're paper tigers, just plans, nothing concrete, just plans and PowerPoint presentations. Now, as far as this nuclear investor is concerned, well, there are several lines going from TerraPower to Funk, Kanal, his foundation, Microsoft. And what's interesting here is we also find the EU Commission here. Unfortunately, you can't see it on my screen, but there's also Breakthrough Energy Ventures Europe at the bottom. And So venture capital coming from this group of billionaires and from European taxpayers is pooled in order to move forward in terms of nuclear power. Now let's take a look at the upper left at TerraPower. There's a number of lines there linking them with others. So TerraPower is partially funded by the American Ministry of Energy, the DOE, Department of Energy, and the Los Alamos Research Project. I think we already heard about them in Alex's presentation. This is where the American nuclear bomb was developed. And there are also links to veterans in energy. So we're not going to work through this network, but we are getting a suspicion that what they are presenting in nicely animated video clips, well, there are people behind this who are not really trying to protect the climate at all. So here he is again, the founder of TerraPower, the face to the outside world for protecting the climate. And in February, he published a book, How to Avoid the Climate Disaster and what solutions exist out there. And he published this in several languages: English, German, French, Spanish, Italian, Dutch, Swedish, Finnish, Chinese, Czech, and so on and so forth. So he really wants to tell the entire world what his solutions are. And he's getting a whole lot of attention, at least as far as Germany is concerned. So there's a very strong media presence there. He was in many talk shows, and he was given a lot of media space. What's a lot more interesting than the foreign minister of TerraPower is the president and CEO of TerraPower, because his biography is exemplary for the so-called new nuclear startups, and they're not that new after all, because the personnel of, well, we know them from earlier nuclear corporations, but his career is also exemplary for people coming from the old nuclear corporations. And that tells us more about the people behind the scenes rather than Bill Gates, who is in the forefront of the media in order to tell the audience about his narrative, how to save the climate. Now, let's take a look at the biography of Chris Lewis. He started his 30-year career in the nuclear industry as an official of a nuclear submarine. So he spent some time on board of 2 nuclear-powered submarines. This engineer came from the MIT. He surveyed the criticality and reactor tests for these nuclear submarines. And please listen closely. In his military story, it was about nuclear drives, and the submarines where he worked, they're both powered with nuclear energy, and he worked with ballistic as well as traditional weapons on board. But that's not what it's about.
He also worked in shipbuilding, in the armaments industry, for the production of large components. He held several management positions in nuclear-capable shipyards, and from the Navy he changed over to civil reactor builders. And anti-nuclear activists could give rise for hope. Until 2013, he was the deputy project manager at Areva at a disastrous construction site at Areva Olkiluoto, which was started in 2005 and had not been commissioned. And another station in terms of civil reactor construction was at Westinghouse, where he acted as vice president for the Virgil Summer 2-3 nuclear project, and both projects were discontinued. Levesque is also member of the board of Nuclear Energy Institute, which has a huge influence in the White House and in the Congress, and is also an active member of Veterans in Energy, and says, I'm very proud of the fact that my company, TerraPower, employs talented veterans. In the armed forces, for a very long time, according to him, nuclear energy has been used for the propulsion of submarines and ships, and this had created a well-trained military staff in parallel to civil industry and civil military exchange. So, and we are going to hear about this account more often during this during the presentation, there is a system of communicating tubes, so to speak, for the civil and for the military realm, and this is a process that is very, very transparent. Yes, if the nuclear enthusiasts do not voice their opinion, means in press conferences, but if they change opinions in their peer groups, then you get more information during the congresses on the background of their nuclear euphoria, expansion of the runtime. If you ask, is it a bridge technology as it is sold to the general public, or is it rather a placeholder? So are the old reactors placeholders until the new ones are being realized? So he says, in order for the new generation of reactors to follow, we have to keep the old reactor fleet up and running. Levesque is a wonderful example of civil military revolving door careers, which is also excellently documented for the UK and France, two other huge nuclear powers, about which I'm going to talk in greater detail later on, as opposed to Gates, who exclusively plays the climate trump card. Levesque is presenting himself as an enthusiastic Navy nuclear guy and describes the long military tradition running in his family. And on the TerraPower website, and please check it out, he also published greetings on the Happy Veterans Day. I would like to talk about the transparency of the education for civil and military nuclear occupations. And from British parliamentary documents, you can you can find very interesting information. Here is a snippet from a hearing from the House of Commons, where many professionals from the nuclear energy industry, from armaments firms, and from different industries provided some information and came together for the purpose of this hearing. And I would like to take a quotation from the Professional Nuclear Energy Association, and they broach the question systematically. The question of overlap between the civil and the military realm can be divided in two sections: weapons on the one hand, and on the other hand, nuclear submarine propulsion in warships. And this is a very important point, nuclear marine propulsion, because it totally depends on this totally depends the credibility of nuclear deterrence, and they are also willing to invest a lot of money, but money doesn't suffice. We also need cross-subsidization from civil nuclear energy, for example, the general overhaul of the British submarine fleet, for which 31 billion British pounds were earmarked. I do not know where the money has gone meanwhile. And this professional association explained to us very exactly what the difference is between nuclear weapons and the nuclear propulsions. It was said the ones working on the weapons designs have more to do with nuclear physics than with electricity, with energy engineering. On the other hand, there is a greater extent of commonality between engineers working in civil nuclear energy and the ones involved in propulsion systems used for submarines. In order for you to understand better, I would like to use a little bit our sense of humor and trigger your sense of humor, and would like to explain what is so great about the fact that nuclear propulsion for submarines is so important for nuclear powers. So the chain reaction doesn't need any oxygen, and so it is possible to stay underwater for quite a long time. And you do not have a diesel propulsion, yes, as a backup, but you don't have a combustion system. There is nothing blubbering, and there are no possibilities for geolocation, at least most of these systems. And this is why nuclear propulsion for these submarines is so important. The father of the nuclear submarine propulsion is Heino Rickover, and there is a wonderful cartoon from the 1950s, an animated movie where he explains how it works with the nuclear propulsion. And way back then in the 40s and the 1950s, when everything started with nuclear energy, there was a myriad of possibilities of choosing fissile material, cooling agents, and at the end of the day, the pressurized water reactor system was used. And if you use a pressurized boiling pot in the kitchen, then you know that you need a stable envelope in order to keep everything together so that things do not explode, and pressures in a pressurized water reactor much more higher than. So if water boils at 300 degrees, so you would have to have a very, very thick steel shield in order to keep everything together. In the super movie, we see the nice assistant with the lead shield building everything about the submarine, because the little admirals that are underway here, of course, they have to be protected against radiation. So all in all, this is quite tough. And the ones of you who have watched scuba divers can see that they take their lead belts with them in order to stay underwater. This is great for submarines. But the idea basically for other realms was not so good. Such a lead albatross tends to go down very quickly. This creates a lot of attention, which is not very good for military purposes. And on top of the heavy pressurized water boiler, you have lead shield. So it's not very good for flying vessels. So here we have the charging station. If you want to glide through the oceans for quite a long time, then of course you have a problem if you run out of fuel on the way, and if you have to appear close to the enemy and ask him for fuel. This would be stupid. Or if you are detected by your enemies when you come out of the water. This is not optimal for warfare. So pressurized water reactors are the means of choice here. Again, I would like to appeal to your sense of humor in order to trigger understanding for why renewable energies are not suitable for preserving second strike capability. What is second strike capability? Let's assume I'm one country, you are my enemy, you have nuclear missiles, you think that I'm stupid, and you think that Eva's country should be razed to the ground with the nuclear missiles. nice idea, but before you get started, before you start firing away, you think, well, she has nuclear missiles as well attached to her submarine. We can't see them. And tomorrow she might appear off our coast. And even if Eva's country might be razed to the ground and reduced to ashes, her bodies will come tomorrow and will be off our coast and will lay our country to ashes. So we'll just refrain from that. Photovoltaic cells and wind power cannot be used for that because underwater there is no sun shining, and the wind turbines, of course, they would be very, very disturbing, and there is no wind going underwater, so wind cannot be used as propulsion for the submarine. So there are two propulsion reactors, so the cooling water is being sucked in, and this way, of course, you can transport national pride from A to B. Going from A to B underwater, I would like to talk about the training infrastructure because Alex Rosen said it so aptly. Civil nuclear energy is the backbone in order for the military nuclear energy to work perfectly. And this has to do with the training infrastructure. The Dalton Nuclear Institute, a representative of which was also part of a House of Commons hearing. So he gave very important details about how civil and military realms interact with each other and are dependent on each other. So, and the overlap and the synergies were being represented in table form in both areas. You need mechanical engineers, plant electronic engineers, specialists for radiochemistry, radiophysics, radiation protection, material science, thermodynamics, fluidics, thermohydraulics, data evaluations, reactor safety, and so on and so forth. And this is just the part of the training infrastructure where there is a certain degree of overlap, and the Dalton Nuclear Institute, by its own account, the worldwide leading research and training institution in nuclear energy, deals with the construction of plants, extending the operating period, disposal of radioactive waste. And if you think about the number of trained experts that you need for civil reactors or for some propulsion reactors for warships, how many experts do you need per academic year? You need a certain degree of continuity in order to preserve it. How many instructors do you need? Does everything crash if one of the few instructors is no longer available for one reason or another? So this cannot be implemented. It's not feasible. Civil nuclear energy is the guarantor of the infrastructure so that the nuclear submarines can glide through the oceans of this world day in, day out. The Dalton Nuclear Institute made a wonderful statement on the training infrastructure. In the past, the military program has been developed very much in isolation from the civil program. So, because of secret information. So the United Kingdom is not now in the position of having financial or personnel resources to develop both programs in isolation. My favorite quotation. So this link has to be carefully managed to avoid the perception that civil and military nuclear programs are one and the same. Alex Rosen, during his wonderful presentation, pointed to a study from the University of Sussex, and I recommend it. I recommend it to read it from back to back. And the study author, Emily Cox, Andy Sterling, and Johnston, they really checked very thoroughly which arguments would speak for the continuation of nuclear energy in Great Britain outside the military realm. And they didn't find any arguments that would hold water. And they saw the military as the driving force behind the nuclear affinity of the British government. And Andy Sterling said it very, very aptly and very poignantly. If a state wants to build one of the most complex constructions anywhere that has ever been developed, a submarine that is nuclear powered in its own country, then it would need the entire industrial base, research capacities, university capacities, engineering, safety engineering, innovation development, all sciences, training sites and instructors and trainers. So this means, well, yes, this dual principle of training and education of civil and military training infrastructure. Well, it is very traceable that it is like this, and the logical consequence is that there are many civil military revolving door carriers, exactly as with TerraPower. With NewScale, there are different cases. In Hinkley Point, there are similar cases in France. There is also a series of examples of this. A representative of the defense contractor explained to the parliament that he remembers quite well that nuclear energies were the pariahs at the college. So this is nothing to brag about if you say, well, I'm currently in a training program in order to kill people in a qualified manner. So the industry, the armaments industry had great difficulty to recruit talents, and especially in cases when there were PR disasters, 3 Mile Island, for example, Fukushima, Chernobyl, and then it got really, really difficult. I tried a little bit to do some slam poetry and tried to come up with a satirical ad, and I would like to read it out to you. It goes as follows. On the quest for nuclear engineers, you could, for example, write you are young, you have completed an engineering program, and you are interested in weapons of mass destruction. We are a European nuclear power and want to remain that way. I think it would be easier to recruit talents with peaceful messages, but today we would communicate quite openly that the common use of nuclear infrastructure takes off burden of the defense budget for your new training site at Hinkley Point. With the support of a sophisticated subsidy strategy, we secured some money that would not be feasible via the direct allocation of tax money to the military budget. It would be quite stupid for the Minister of Defense if he would have to explain that he needs even more money. So cross-subsidization via the electricity consumers would be much better. And in order to provide more evidence, we have a brochure from RollsRoyce, who for more than 60 years produce nuclear-powered propulsions for submarines. And here there are some highly interesting passages providing evidence that civil nuclear energy is the guarantor of infrastructure for the military part of the propulsion of ships. And here we can find very nice quotations. The expansion of qualified material in terms of nuclear capabilities would take a lot of burden off the defense ministry, and this would free up valuable resources for other uses. If we take a look at all this in quantitative terms, we might see the following. If you take a look at the number of reactors that are civil and how many propulsion reactors we have for warships and especially for submarines, here on the pie of truth, we can see that 75% of all nuclear reactors, only in terms of the numbers, are destined for civil use, and there are very few destined for military use. And If we take a look at installed power, then we can see that the ratio is much more dramatic. The biggest share is held by civil and a small share of installed nuclear capacity can be allocated to warships. Yes, and from this, of course, result economic scaling effects. Unit costs go down as the number of units goes up. And this doesn't only apply for the reactors per se, but also for materials, for the components industry. This is also very important to note. Just imagine that the cycles, well, in the order books are very irregular. If you only have few reactors that are being overhauled every few decades, and in between you only need a few components, so it's very difficult to organize regular cycles in the order books. The low number of units and the big intervals between the orders. So let's take another look at that and what it means for the components industry. It becomes quite clear taking a look at a screenshot from the Neue Zürcher Zeitung daily, talking about the fact that new attack submarines emphasize France's power. It's about the launching of the first of 6 new attack submarines. Also, French President Macron was present, and there was talk about them being low noise and them being so difficult to geolocate. And then it was also said that the attack submarine fleet from the 1980s is being renewed now for 9 billion euros. 70 days on the way. Very, very absolutely great. I would like to talk about the old submarine fleet from the 1980s. Just imagine you are in the components industry for nuclear propulsions or for nuclear capable shipyards producing nuclear powered submarines. And every few decades after the 1980s, there is an order coming in all of a sudden. And in between, when submarines only had to be maintained, you have to have employees, you have to have staff that can ensure that spare parts are produced that are excellent in terms of safety engineering. And so you need a guarantor for civil infrastructure so that the machinery can be kept running. Accordingly, of course, it is quite clear that in the article of Neue Zürcher Zeitung, or in all articles published on the launching of the new nuclear submarines, there was not one single word said about the question, is this climate-friendly warfare? Do warming stripes during the launching of a nuclear submarine play a role? Because CO2 free warfare is such a great thing. Military strategists never cared about climate protection for the propulsion reactors of the warships. So nuclear power serves the purpose of reach, non-traceability, and second strike capability. I think this is the last slide that I wanted to present. So this is a cartoon that came into being when the Hinkley Point plans became published. It's very interesting to read in the British media who was against it. And some people said that Hinkley Point is really absolute junk. This was the former energy minister, the biggest bank of Europe, multinational energy firm, shareholders in the nuclear energy, members of the upper house, and a conservative mayor. So all of them voiced criticism as regards the most the most expensive power plant. So, and they all said, so let's rather build small modular reactors. Nuclear energy is not that bad. And I hope that most of you who listened, well, have seen that the new nuclear power plants, generation 3 or 4, it doesn't matter. So it's always old wine in new skins. It's always about cross-subsidization, revenues from the sale of electricity, the maintenance of supply chains and order books, full order books in all parts of the components industry. It's about special materials, not only fissile materials or mining, but also about the materials that have to comply with the specific requirements of nuclear plants. It's about research and development, reactor design, materials for new problem solutions, about the training infrastructure, about economic scaling effects. So the higher the unit costs are, then the lower the costs per unit are. It's about the entire industrial basis. And even the conservative Telegraph said on the topic, the government can finance robust nuclear deterrence, but politics and media should stop acting as if it were about energy policy. Well, on this topic, well, I have found a lot of hints on the internet under the Atoms for War hashtag, which is much more honest than the statement Atoms for Peace. You can find a lot on this topic on the internet. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them.
Danke für diesen für manche sehr anregenden Vortrag. Wir werden nicht drum herum kommen, hier ein paar Fragen zu verlesen. Die erste, ehrlich gesagt, die würde ich am liebsten selber beantworten. Rainer Ratz meint, warum gibt es bei der Veranstaltung keine Gegenstimmen als Speaker? Das ist ja wie in der SED-Partei. Nun, ich möchte das so beantworten. Wir haben jetzt schon ein bisschen Budget, aber wenn ich das mit dem Budget der Atomlobby vergleiche.
Well, we have a budget, but if I compare it with the budget of the nuclear lobby, well, we don't want to sponsor them as well. I had to say that, sorry. Eva, we have a question that you're going to like. Do you think it is right to conjure up fear against nuclear energy by mixing up military and civilian use? Well, I didn't do that. That is something that is coming from the arms industry and from the nuclear industry. You can see this in the brochures of the arms groups. You can't read it in the press releases of the nuclear power plants that want to focus more on the protection of the climate side. But of course, that fears are conjured up. Well, why? I mean, I fully agree with the author of the Telegraph who said that if you want to have a nuclear deterrent, okay, then talk about it and sell it that way. And don't say that it's all just about producing energy. There was another question coming from the same author who said that you are aware of the fact that pressurized water reactors are used for every thermal power plant. Yes, I'm aware of that. Yeah, that's a well-known fact. And in the 60s and 70s, the fossil nuclear reactor park they are all experiencing fatigue at the same time. And yeah, the principle is the same, that is clear. And another political question asked by Philip Kronbicher. Germany has submarines with fuel cells, but the hydrogen for that can also be produced with renewables, right? Yes, it works. The Swedes have that too. And they seem to work so well that during military exercises, they would have penetrated the area where there was a big aircraft carrier of the Americans, Ronald Reagan. So sometimes they're saying, what should we do with wind power if you need to refuel nuclear submarines? But that has something to do with deep state. It's not that, well, nuclear submarines cannot be found at all because there's this Swedish hydrogen-fueled submarines that can penetrate the area around the aircraft carrier, and they could have sunk it if it hadn't been an exercise. And the nuclear submarines also have a drawback because, of course, they're leaving some radioisotopes in their groove, and there are ways of detecting that, so they're not invisible. So there are not just arguments in favor of nuclear propulsion systems for submarines, but there seem to be some that think that it's a great propulsion. So BAE Systems or RollsRoyce for many decades, well, maybe they want to convert to hydrogen at some point. It would be possible. Okay, thank you very much, dear Eva. We need a short break until we can move on to the last two presentations. Maybe all these many questions can be addressed during the big Q&A session. Manfred Doppler, I think, can hold back his question or can wait for the answer to his question until then. So I will let you go for a short break, and at 4:40 we should be back, and then we start with our American block of presentations. I'm looking forward to Arnie Anderson and Linda Petzkanter's presentation. See you at 4:40. Thank you.